What's up, Manna students? Mackenzie here again in our new series that we started last week called Now You See Me, which is a study in Daniel. I am so excited to bring you week 2 of our message today. Whether you're watching at your student site group or you're watching online on our Manna Church YouTube or our Manna Students Facebook, we are so glad that you decided to join us today. Here's what I want to open up with today. Have you ever wondered how God chooses to reveal himself? Like, you ask questions that go along the lines of, why is God showing himself and doing all these miraculous things in the Bible, yet we don't see these things necessarily happening in today's world, in today's life, in your life, maybe? I'll be honest, I've had some of these questions myself, but as I've gone into studying the Bible a little bit more and experiencing God in my own life, I've come to learn that oftentimes God is always moving, yet we're not always watching or we're not always listening. We don't always recognize God moving. Here's the real truth. God often uses our circumstances to reveal himself. He uses what we say as our story or our testimony or pieces of our life, what we go through, to reveal himself, to share who he is and what he's doing. He uses experiences and circumstances in our life to do that, which is actually really, really cool. We're going to talk about what that looks like through this study in Daniel, through chapter 3 as we go into today. But first, I want to just cover last week, Bryson talked about how God is faithful, therefore we should be faithful. And this week, our big idea is God's power can be shown through his heart in protecting us. But before we dive into that, I'm going to ask you another question. What is something that you are terrified of? Like, what is something you are so afraid of that you think if you encounter this thing or this thing happens, you might die? For me, I am claustrophobic, which claustrophobia is simply a fear of being in small spaces. More specifically to me, I fear being confined. I fear that if I'm in a space where I can't escape, that I'm going to, I just get really, really stressed out. Small spaces, confined spaces freak me out to no end, where if I'm even watching a movie and somebody's in a very confined space, it freaks me out and I get the heebie-jeebies from it. But small spaces are something that I am terrified of. It might be slightly unreasonable to think that if I'm confined in a small space that I might die, but to me, in certain situations, it certainly feels like that. I know that some people have fears of snakes, some people have fears of sharks maybe, some people might be afraid of the dark, or even some people might think about the fear of drowning as a possibility, which is a very realistic fear. But whatever it is, whether it's unrealistic that you think you might die if you encounter it, or actually realistic if it does happen, there is the possibility of death, which is very scary. I want to talk about chapter 3 in Daniel today. I want to reference Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and their story of what happens in chapter 3 because they face something very, very scary. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we talked a little bit about last week. They were actually the guys that Daniel had brought along with and been on the same sort of journey that Daniel had been on. They were following the same rules and same morals, eating the same food as Daniel. Therefore, when it came time for Daniel to be put in a position of authority, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were also put in a position of authority, although not as high as Daniel. They still had somewhat of a favor with the king. The king kind of favored them as well until chapter 3 of Daniel. So in chapter 3 of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego actually face fire, which is terrifying. They actually face being put to death by fire. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We need to start with the beginning of chapter 3, and we need to start with King Nebuchadnezzar. While we're not going to go into much detail about King Nebuchadnezzar this week, because we're actually going to be talking a whole lot about him next week, the thing that we do need to know about King Nebuchadnezzar at this time is that he was a sinful man. Very, very sinful, very prideful, actually. And in the very first verse of Daniel chapter 3, we actually read about King Nebuchadnezzar creating a very large idol covered in gold. Not only did he create an idol, and we've talked about this before, idols are wrong, sinful. He created a gold idol, but he was also now requiring everybody that followed him, everybody that was underneath him, to bow down and worship this idol. The issue here is that some of his subjects, some of his followers, including Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are Jewish. They already have a God in which they serve, in which they worship. So the Jewish people that are underneath Nebuchadnezzar are to worship only their God, not idols. So with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they do not bow down and worship this idol when they are told to. So inevitably, they get told on. Somebody tells on them. And King Nebuchadnezzar is not happy with this. He actually responds with this. We're going to be in Daniel chapter 3 this whole time. So Daniel chapter 3:13 says this: "Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, 'Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made. Very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?'" King Nebuchadnezzar isn't playing games. Obviously, that very last question is actually a question that I feel like he's taunting them with. He's saying, you can worship my idol, or you can be put to death by fire. And then we can see whose God is gonna win. But here's the deal. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego also aren't playing games, and they're not swayed by the threat that King Nebuchadnezzar has to give them. We continue on in verse 16 with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replying to the king. They say, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he doesn't, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are full of integrity. They are men who are not going to bow down to a king simply because he threatens them, which in this situation, it can seem very reasonable why they might, because they are being threatened by being thrown into fire. They are being threatened by death, but they don't back down, which has to mean that they're full of integrity. But they're also not just full of integrity, they're full of faith, because what they're saying here is that even if they're put into the fire, their God will save them. Our God will save them. They have immense faith and trust in God. They believe so much in God's power and in God's heart for them that they know, regardless of what King Nebuchadnezzar decides to do to them, that God will protect them. If you were challenged by your biggest fear, now I'm not saying being thrown into the fire is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's biggest fear, but it is something that's really scary. If you were faced by your biggest challenge, your biggest fear perhaps, the question is, would you choose to trust in God? Do you think that you could boldly stand up for your faith, even faced with something as scary as being put to death? I think we would all like to say yes, but the truth is that that's something that's really, really daunting. It's something that's very scary. But then again, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they know God's power. They know and have faith in God. So let's see what happens. Verse 19 says, "Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual," which is fair that he gets upset because he threw out some sass, and then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came back with some sass, very justifiable sass. but now he's mad. So he turns the furnace 7 times hotter, which I did some research, a little bit of research on this. And with the technology at the time, it wasn't necessarily possible for the furnace to get 7 times hotter. But let's just say that the furnace is now as hot as it can possibly be. So that's where he's got it at. And then he commands some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace is so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, your majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 men around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like the son of gods." There's a lot that happens in this short passage. One, the fire is hot, like hot. So hot that the people who are walking the 3 to be put into the fire are burned up before they even get to the fire. The soldiers that were supposed to throw them into the fire died before they even got to the fire. That's how hot it is. I don't know if you've ever been around a campfire that's so hot you have to move your camping chair all the way back, but it's hot. Not only that, but out of all of that, they survive. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are now walking around in the fire completely unharmed. They're now unbound, as well as, I don't know if you caught, that there's a 4th person with them, and that 4th person in King Nebuchadnezzar's eyes looks like a son of God. Lots happening here. Continuing 26. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. And the satraps, prefects, governors, and royals' advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their head singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. This is insane. Imagine the power of God revealed in this very moment. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into a fire. That is the hottest it can be, and they come out completely unscathed, completely fine. Even their clothes are in perfect proportion of what it was before they went into the fire. This is impossible. This cannot happen. I don't know if you've ever watched somebody to walk into a fire. They do not come out unscathed. That does not happen. But what's even cooler than that is that this happened in front of everybody. This demonstration of the power of God happened in front of everybody, and it happened in front of King Nebuchadnezzar. And this is his response. King Nebuchadnezzar actually praises God. In verse 28, he says, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God." And he continues on actually after this verse and continues to praise their God, because who wouldn't? Honestly, this is an incredible move of God. The point in this is that we can see God's power through his heart to protect us. You may be wondering, how does this apply to me? I figure you're not going around defying a lot of kings and being threatened by, being thrown into fire pits often. If you are, I'm sure you have some amazing stories, but I'm sure that that's not something that happens on the regular for you. But here's the thing, I can almost guarantee that there have been situations in your life, although not legit furnaces, but there may be some stuff in our lives today that we face that might feel like we're walking through fire. Whether it's some physical or emotional pain or some complications in relationships with family members or friends, there have been times in our life that I can guarantee that we have desperately needed God's protection, or we have desperately needed the power of God in our life. So whether it's walking through that physical or emotional pain, I know that sometimes life can feel like walking through fire. But here's some truths that I think we can gain from this story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that we can apply in our own lives, in situations in our own lives where we might feel like we're walking through the fire. The first one is this: God can use our hardest times to work it out for His good. That seems completely opposite, but honestly, some of the hardest things that we can go to, God can use to form us, to grow us, to stretch us, and to put us exactly in the place where we need to be. And believe it or not, God can use our hard times to glorify Himself. We see that in this passage. All those that watched couldn't deny the power of God, especially after Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had previously made a claim of that God would save them. They were able to reveal the power of God, and they were able to reveal that after they had already made a claim that the power of their God would. So everybody was able to watch that God actually provided and protected them. The second truth that I think we can gain from this is God is with you. God is with you always. Back in verse 25, we notice that there's a fourth man that's walking with them, and there isn't much that goes into describing what that is or who that is, but there is the idea that, there is the fact that King Nebuchadnezzar states that he looks like a son of God. Here's the thing. Even when we're walking through the fire, God is with us, and His heart is to protect us. Furthermore, we're not even meant to walk through the fire alone. If we are walking through the fire, God wants to be with us. There is a point and a reason why that probably is happening, and we can't see that, and we can't even go through it without Him. We are at our best when we are walking with Him. God is our protector, and we must understand that God loves us and cares for us, and His heart is to protect us. And through that, He can reveal His power in us and through us. You see, not only are we getting something out of this, not only is God moving in our lives, but through that demonstration, through whatever the circumstance is and what our story has become from it, we are able to share the power of God, much like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That circumstance might just show who God is and what God can do to those around us, and also remind us of the power of God. Manna students, I want to thank you so much for being a part of this message this evening. I would love to talk about this further, not me personally with you, but within our small groups tonight. We will talk about them. Also, if you aren't able to join us in person, that is okay. We will include the small group questions in the description below so you can discuss it with your parents, with your friends, or just for personal thought. We are going to move on to week 3 next week, and we can't wait to see you there.